political sham since I've been in politics. And if you really wanted to know the truth,
I have to be honest with you. This is one of the biggest political implosions I've ever witnessed. Every single day, Trump seems to stumble into a new crisis. This isn't just failure anymore. This is the slow motion collapse of a political empire that once looked untouchable, and somehow, unbelievably, he has still managed to make it worse. Because his secret peace plan, which is anything but a peace plan, has leaked. It's a gift-wrapped surrender note to Vladimir Putin, topped off with what might as well be Trump's signature scribbled in crayon like a child turning in homework he clearly didn't read. And it doesn't end the war in Ukraine so much as hand Putin everything he wants on a silver platter: territory, leverage, and validation. People are furious, outraged, and surprisingly, almost comically, one of those furious people is Lindsey Graham, who after years spent obediently defending Trump is now publicly swatting at him, calling the plan problematic.
Okay, so Lindsey Graham just did something absolutely unthinkable for someone in his position right now, and the fallout from this is creating total chaos inside the Republican Party at the worst possible moment for both Graham and Trump. We're talking about a public break between one of Trump's most loyal allies and the president himself, broadcast live on national television, and the timing could not be more catastrophic for both of them. This isn't just awkward political theater. This is a fundamental crack in the foundation of Trump's second-term power structure, and it's happening while Graham is staring down a brutal primary challenge from the MAGA base that already thinks he's too establishment, too willing to compromise, too much of a Washington insider. The White House is watching this unfold in real time. Republicans on Capitol Hill are absolutely scrambling to figure out how to respond, and Trump himself is reportedly furious that one of his closest Senate allies just went on television and called one of his signature first-week actions a massive mistake. Now, before we get into exactly what Graham said and why this matters so much more than it looks like on the surface, let me just be real with you for a second. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore to give you the full picture on stories like this. They'll cover the soundbite, they'll show you the clip, but they won't explain the institutional power dynamics at play, the primary math that makes this so dangerous for Graham, or the precedent this sets for other Republicans who might be thinking about breaking with Trump on anything. That's why we built this channel, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin on what's actually happening in American politics right now. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines and understand not just what happened, but why it matters and what comes next, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. We bring the news straight to you every single day, breaking down the power plays, the institutional conflicts, and the electoral calculations that mainstream outlets won't touch. Just hit the subscribe button below to join us. And if you want to support this work and be part of a community that truly cares about understanding how power actually works in Washington, this is your moment. Subscribe, leave a comment with your thoughts on this Graham-Trump split, and let's keep building something real here. Here's what happened. On Sunday, January 26, 2025, just 6 days into Trump's second term as president, Lindsey Graham appeared on NBC's Meet the Press for what was supposed to be a fairly routine interview about the new administration's first week in office. Graham is the senior senator from South Carolina. He's the chair of the Senate Budget Committee. He's been one of Trump's most visible and vocal defenders for years now, going back to the 2024 campaign when most other prominent Republicans were still hedging their bets about whether to fully back Trump's comeback bid. Graham has been there at the rallies. He's been there on Fox News night after night defending Trump's agenda. He's been there golfing with the president at Mar-a-Lago. Their relationship has been documented as genuinely close on a personal level. Graham calls Trump a friend. Trump calls Graham a loyal ally. They talk regularly. They coordinate strategy. So when Graham sits down with Kristen Welker on Meet the Press, everyone expects the usual talking points about how great the first week has been, how Trump is keeping his campaign promises, how the administration is moving fast to implement its agenda. That's not what happened. Welker asks Graham about Trump's decision on his very first day back in office, January 20th, to issue blanket pardons for approximately 1,500 people who were convicted of crimes or pleaded guilty to crimes related to the January 6, 2021 attack on the United States Capitol. This was one of Trump's most oft-repeated campaign promises throughout 2023 and 2024. He said it at rally after rally. He promised he would pardon the January 6 defendants. He called them patriots. He called them political prisoners. He said they were being persecuted by a weaponized Justice Department. And he delivered on that promise within hours of taking the oath of office. The pardons were sweeping and comprehensive, covering everyone from people who simply walked through the Capitol to people who were convicted of assaulting federal officers, to the leadership of far-right militia groups like the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys who had been convicted of seditious conspiracy. Over 140 police officers were injured during the January 6th attack. Some officers suffered traumatic brain injuries, some lost fingers, some were tased, some were beaten with flagpoles and fire extinguishers. And 172 people who were pardoned by Trump had pleaded guilty to or were convicted of violently assaulting law enforcement officers on that day. So, Welker asks Graham about this, and specifically about the decision to pardon people who committed violent acts against police officers. And Graham, live on national television in front of millions of viewers, says something that you almost never hear from a Trump ally in his position. He says, quote, "Pardoning the people who went into the Capitol and beat up a police officer violently, I think was a mistake, because it seems to suggest that's an okay thing to do." He goes further. He says, "I fear that you will get more violence." He acknowledges that Trump had the legal authority to issue the pardons. He points out that Trump promised during the campaign that he would do this, so it's not like he's surprising anyone. But then, Graham says explicitly that he thinks this specific aspect of the pardons, the violent offenders, the people who assaulted cops, that was wrong. And then he adds that law enforcement groups, the very constituency that Trump and Republicans claim to champion more than anyone else, they didn't like this either. Now, Welker follows up. She asks Graham if he's conveyed this directly to Trump, if he's told the president to his face that he thinks this was a mistake. And Graham says that there's been no better supporter of law enforcement than Trump in general, but that a lot of people who supported Trump, including people in law enforcement, didn't like this decision. He tries to soften it a bit by comparing it to Biden pardoning his family members on the way out of office. He tries to make it about consistency in opposing pardons for people who commit violence, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. But the core message is unmistakable. Lindsey Graham, one of Trump's closest allies in the Senate, thinks the president made a serious mistake on one of his very first actions back in office. And then, later that same day, Graham appears on CNN's State of the Union with Dana Bash and reiterates essentially the same position. He tells Bash that he doesn't agree with Trump's decision to pardon the January 6th attackers who committed violence. Two major national television appearances on the same Sunday, both breaking with the president on the same issue, both saying explicitly that Trump was wrong. This is not a private conversation that leaked. This is not an anonymous source quoted in a newspaper. This is Lindsey Graham putting his name and his face on national television and publicly criticizing Donald Trump on a matter of presidential authority and law enforcement, two issues that are absolutely central to Trump's political brand and to the Republican base's support for him. Now here's the problem, and this is where things start to get really messy really fast. Lindsey Graham is not in a position where he can afford to be publicly breaking with Donald Trump on anything, let alone something this visible and this emotionally charged for the MAGA base. Graham is up for re-election in 2026. He's seeking his fifth term in the Senate, and he's already facing what's shaping up to be a brutal primary challenge from the right. Paul Dans, the guy who ran Project 2025 at the Heritage Foundation before he was pushed out during the 2024 campaign when Project 2025 became toxic politically, Dans announced in July 2025 that he's challenging Graham in the Republican primary. Dans is running explicitly as the anti-establishment, anti-Washington, drain the swamp candidate. His entire pitch is that Lindsey Graham has been in Washington too long, that he's too willing to cut deals with Democrats, that he's too much of a rhino, Republican in name only, that he represents exactly the kind of entrenched Senate power structure that Trump was elected to dismantle. And Dans has a point that resonates with a significant chunk of the South Carolina Republican base. Graham used to be a fierce Trump critic. Back in December 2015, during the 2016 Republican primary, Graham called Trump a, quote, race-baiting, xenophobic, religious bigot who would destroy the Republican Party and the country. Graham ran for president himself in 2016. He was eliminated early, and then after Trump won the nomination, Graham went through one of the most dramatic political transformations in modern American politics. He became a Trump loyalist. He became a Trump defender. He became Trump's golfing buddy and his go-to guy in the Senate for advancing the Trump agenda. And a lot of hardcore MAGA supporters never fully trusted that transformation. They've always seen Graham as someone who's too transactional, too willing to say whatever he needs to say to stay in power, too connected to the old Republican establishment. When Trump endorsed Graham for re-election back in March 2025, significant portions of the MAGA base erupted in anger. Conservative commentators, Trump supporters on social media, grassroots activists, they all criticized Trump for backing Graham. Being libertarian, an account with nearly 288,000 followers, called it, quote, a sad reminder that politics is ugly and the swamp still has a lot of power. Bonchi from Red State wrote that what bothered him wasn't just that Trump endorsed Graham, it was, quote, the lying about who Graham is that gets me. Kylie Jane Creamer, who helped organize the January 6, 2021 Save America rally that preceded the Capitol attack, anyone needs to primary Lindsey Graham. America First Insight, a group that champions the America First agenda, said flat out, quote, well, I'll tell you what, we certainly won't be endorsing Lindsey Graham. So Graham is already in a weak position with the base. He needs Trump's endorsement to survive a primary challenge from someone like Paul Dans, who can credibly claim to be the true MAGA candidate. Chris LaCivita, who was a senior advisor to Graham's campaign, and who also co-managed Trump's 2024 presidential campaign, he came out hard against Dans when he announced, saying that Dans had been, quote, unceremoniously dumped in 2024 while trying to torpedo Donald Trump's historic campaign, and that he's now, quote, parachuted himself into the state of South Carolina in direct opposition to President Trump's longtime friend and ally in the Senate. LaCivita predicted that Dance's campaign and Trump's commitment to people, his loyalty to political allies, that's always been conditional. It's always been transactional. Trump turns on people all the time when they stop being useful to him, or when they publicly challenge him, or when the base turns against them strongly enough that defending them becomes a political liability for him. And now Graham has just gone on national television, twice in one day, and publicly said that Trump made a mistake, that Trump's decision to pardon violent January 6th rioters was wrong, that it sends the wrong message, that it could encourage more violence. Trump is famously sensitive to public criticism from people in his own party. He demands loyalty, he expects his allies to defend him no matter what, and when people break with him publicly, especially on issues that are central to his political identity, he tends to respond harshly. He's rescinded endorsements before. He's turned on allies before. He's attacked Republicans who criticized him, even people who were generally supportive but who disagreed with him on one specific issue. And this isn't just any issue. The January 6th pardons are deeply personal for Trump. He views the January 6th defendants as his people, as supporters who were there for him when he needed them, as victims of a politically motivated Justice Department that's been weaponized against him and anyone associated with him. He promised throughout the campaign that he would pardon them. He made it one of his signature first-day actions, and now one of his closest Senate allies is saying on Meet the Press and CNN that it was a mistake. The White House has got to be absolutely furious about this. Trump himself is reportedly angry, and Graham's trying to walk a very fine line here, trying to maintain his criticism of the pardons while also saying that Trump is generally a great supporter of law enforcement, trying to compare it to Biden's pardons to make it seem less like a direct attack on Trump specifically. But the bottom line is that he publicly broke with the president, and there's no way to spin that into something Trump is going to be happy about. Okay, let's break down what this actually means, because there are multiple layers to this that go way beyond just one senator disagreeing with one presidential decision. First, understand that Graham's criticism is significant precisely because it's about law enforcement and violence. Republicans have built their entire political brand for decades on being the party of law and order. They've positioned themselves as the party that backs the blue, that supports police officers, that's tough on crime, that believes in consequences for lawbreaking. Trump himself ran on law and order themes. He talked constantly about supporting police, about cracking down on crime in democratic cities, about restoring order to communities that he said were being destroyed by liberal policies, and defund the police movements. And his supporters, the MAGA base, they've embraced this identity as the party that stands with law enforcement against radical leftists, who they believe want to tear down police departments and let criminals run wild. So when Trump pardons people who violently assaulted police officers, people who beat cops with flagpoles, people who dragged officers into crowds and attacked them, people who tased officers and caused traumatic brain injuries. That creates a massive contradiction at the heart of the Republican law and order message. How do you claim to be the party that backs the blue when your president just pardoned over 170 people who violently attacked police officers doing their duty to protect the Capitol and the lawmakers inside it during a constitutional crisis? Graham is pointing out this contradiction. He's saying that pardoning violent offenders who assaulted cops sends the message that it's okay to attack police officers as long as you're doing it in support of Trump or in pursuit of a political cause that Trump supports. And that undermines everything Republicans say they stand for on law enforcement issues. Second, this matters because of the precedent it sets for political violence moving forward. Graham explicitly said, quote, "I fear that you will get more violence." He's concerned that the pardons send a signal to Trump supporters that if they commit acts of violence in service of a political cause that Trump endorses, they'll be protected from consequences. They might go to jail for a while, but eventually Trump will pardon them. Trump will call them patriots. Trump will describe them as political prisoners who were being persecuted. That's an extraordinarily dangerous message to send in a country that's already deeply polarized, where political violence has been increasing, where there have been multiple assassination attempts against political figures, including Trump himself, where armed militia groups are active and waiting for signals about what actions are acceptable. If you tell people that political violence in service of the right cause will ultimately be forgiven and even celebrated, you're creating conditions for more violence. Graham understands this, and he's trying to put that message out there publicly, even though he knows it's going to create problems for him with Trump and with the MAGA base. Third, this exposes the fundamental tension inside the Republican Party between institutional conservatives and the Trump movement. Graham is a creature of the Senate. He's been in Congress for decades, first in the House and then in the Senate since 2003. He understands how institutions work. He believes in constitutional order. He believes in the separation of powers. He believes in the rule of law even when it's politically inconvenient. He's willing to bend a lot of those principles to stay in Trump's good graces and to maintain his position of influence. But there are lines even Graham won't cross, and apparently pardoning people who beat up cops is one of those lines. That puts him at odds with the Trump movement, which is much more focused on loyalty to Trump personally than on any abstract principles about law or order or institutional norms. The MAGA base wants Trump to use his power to protect Trump supporters, full stop. They don't care if that contradicts previous Republican talking points about law and order. They don't care if it undermines the institution of the presidency. They don't care if it sets dangerous precedents. They want Trump to fight for them the same way they believe they fought for him on January 6th and in the aftermath of the 2020 election. Fourth, this matters for the 2026 midterm elections and the future of Republican control of the Senate. Graham is far from the only Republican senator who's going to face a competitive race in 2026. Republicans currently have a slim majority in the Senate. They can't afford to lose too many seats. And they're going to be defending multiple vulnerable incumbents in swing states, and even in some red states where primary challenges from the MAGA right could weaken the eventual nominee going into the general election. If Trump starts turning on incumbent senators because they publicly disagreed with him on something, if he starts rescinding endorsements and backing primary challengers against sitting senators who aren't sufficiently loyal, that creates chaos in Republican primaries across the country. It means resources get spent on intra-party fights instead of on defeating Democrats. It means nominees could emerge from primaries who are strong with the MAGA base, but weak with general election voters. It means potential retirements from senators who don't want to deal with primary challenges and who figure they can't win anyway if Trump is actively working against them. Graham is a test case for this dynamic. If Trump pulls his endorsement, if Trump starts attacking Graham, if Trump signals to the base that he wants someone more loyal to replace Graham, that sends a message to every other Republican senator that public criticism of Trump on anything is politically suicidal. It means even senators who privately think Trump is making mistakes, even senators who believe Trump's actions are dangerous or unconstitutional or politically damaging, they'll keep their mouths shut publicly because they know that speaking up means losing Trump's support and probably losing their seat. That's not healthy for a democratic system where legislators are supposed to exercise independent judgment and where the Senate is supposed to be a check on presidential power. It turns the Senate into a rubber stamp for whatever Trump wants to do, which is exactly what Trump wants, but which is terrible for the institutional balance of power that's supposed to prevent any one person or any one branch of government from having unchecked authority. Fifth, this matters internationally because of how it affects America's credibility on rule of law issues around the world. The United States has spent decades positioning itself as a champion of democracy, human rights, rule of law, and peaceful transfers of power. When American presidents and diplomats criticize other countries for political violence, for attacks on democratic institutions, for leaders pardoning their supporters who commit crimes, they're doing so from a position of claiming moral authority based on America's own supposed commitment to those principles. But when an American president pardons over 1,500 people who attacked the Capitol to try to overturn an election, including people who violently assaulted police officers, that completely undermines America's ability to credibly criticize other countries for similar behavior. How does the United States call out authoritarians in other countries for using violence to stay in power when our own president is pardoning people who did exactly that? How do American diplomats lecture other governments about respecting democratic norms when we just watched our own system nearly collapse on January 6th, and then watched the president pardon the people who tried to make it collapse? Allies in Europe, in Asia, in democratic countries around the world, they're watching this, and they're deeply concerned about whether the United States can be a reliable partner for upholding international norms and democratic values. If America can't maintain its own commitment to rule of law and consequences for political violence, why should anyone else? Graham understands these dynamics because he's deeply involved in foreign policy. He's traveled extensively. He's met with foreign leaders. He knows how these actions play internationally. His public criticism of the pardons is in part an attempt to signal to allies that not all American leaders support this, that there are still people in positions of power who believe in the principles America has traditionally claimed to stand for. Sixth, this creates immediate practical problems for Republicans on Capitol Hill, who are trying to advance Trump's legislative agenda.
The first year of a presidential term is typically when you have the most momentum, when you have the most political capital to spend, when you're most likely to get major legislation passed. Trump has an ambitious agenda for his second term. He wants major tax cuts, he wants immigration reform, he wants to build the wall, he wants to dramatically expand domestic energy production. He wants to roll back environmental regulations. He wants to reshape the federal bureaucracy. Most of that requires congressional action. And Republicans have a slim majority in the House and the Senate, which means they need near-perfect party unity to get anything passed because they can't afford to lose more than a handful of votes. But if Trump is fighting with Senate Republicans, if senators are publicly breaking with him on high-profile issues, if there's visible tension between the White House and Capitol Hill Republicans, that makes it much harder to maintain the unity you need to pass controversial legislation. Democrats are going to exploit every crack in Republican unity. They're going to amplify any criticism of Trump from Republican senators. They're going to use it in floor speeches and press releases and campaign ads. And wavering Republicans, the ones who are nervous about some elements of Trump's agenda, they're going to feel more emboldened to vote no or to demand changes if they see that other Republicans are willing to publicly disagree with Trump and survive politically. Graham's criticism of the pardons creates a permission structure for other Republicans to speak up when they think Trump is wrong, which is good for Democratic accountability, but terrible for Trump's ability to ram his agenda through Congress without significant modifications. Seventh, this matters because of what it reveals about Trump's decision-making process and the people around him. Trump campaigned on the January 6th pardons for over 2 years. He had plenty of time to think about how he would handle this, what the parameters would be, who would be included and who wouldn't. And the decision he ultimately made was to issue blanket pardons for everyone, including people convicted of violent crimes against police officers, including militia leaders convicted of seditious conspiracy. There was apparently no distinction made between peaceful protesters who just walked through the Capitol and violent attackers who caused serious injuries. There was no process for individually reviewing cases and making judgments about who deserved clemency and who didn't. It was just a sweeping, comprehensive pardon for everyone associated with January 6th. That suggests that either Trump himself doesn't see any moral distinction between peaceful protest and violent assault, or that the people advising him convinced him that making any distinctions would be politically dangerous because the base wants everyone pardoned and doesn't want to hear about degrees of culpability. Either explanation is deeply troubling. If Trump genuinely doesn't see a problem with pardoning people who beat up cops, that raises serious questions about his judgment and his commitment to law and order principles he claims to champion. If Trump does see a problem with it but did it anyway because his advisors told him the base demands it, that raises questions about whether he has anyone around him who's willing to tell him when something is a bad idea.
or whether everyone in his inner circle is just telling him what he wants to hear, regardless of the consequences. Now, let's talk about what happens next, because this story is far from over, and the next few weeks are going to be absolutely critical for determining how this plays out politically. First, watch whether Trump responds to Graham's criticism. Does he tweet about it? Does he issue a statement? Does he start attacking Graham publicly? Does he hint that he might reconsider his endorsement? Trump's initial response will tell us a lot about how seriously he takes this break and whether he's willing to tolerate any public dissent from Republican senators, even on issues where those senators have legitimate concerns. If Trump stays silent, or if he brushes it off with a mild comment about how everyone's entitled to their opinion, that suggests he's willing to accept that Graham has to maintain some independence to survive politically in South Carolina. If Trump goes on the attack, if he starts questioning Graham's loyalty or suggesting that maybe South Carolina Republicans should consider supporting Paul Dans instead, that's a massive escalation, and it signals that Trump is not going to tolerate any public criticism from anyone in the party. Second, watch whether other Republican senators start speaking up about the pardons or about other Trump actions they disagree with. Graham breaking with Trump could create a permission structure for other senators who have concerns, but who have been afraid to voice them publicly. If you start seeing more Republicans willing to publicly disagree with Trump on specific issues while still supporting his overall agenda, that's a sign that the party is moving toward a healthier relationship with Trump, where he's seen as the leader, but not as someone who has to be agreed with on absolutely everything. If nobody else speaks up, if Graham remains isolated, and if other Republicans either defend the pardons or stay silent, that tells you that most Republican senators are still too afraid of Trump and the base to risk any public criticism even when they privately think he's wrong. Third, watch how law enforcement groups respond. Graham mentioned that law enforcement didn't like the pardons. Are police unions going to start speaking out about this? Are they going to issue statements or hold press conferences or meet with Republican leaders to express their concerns? Law enforcement organizations have traditionally been strong Republican constituencies. They've donated to Republican candidates. They've endorsed Republicans. They've shown up at Republican events. If those groups start feeling like Republicans are abandoning them, or like Trump is sacrificing their interests to appease his political base, that could create a real problem for Republicans in future elections, because law enforcement endorsements and support matter in a lot of districts and states. Fourth, watch the South Carolina Republican primary polling and whether Paul Dans gains any traction from this. Does Dans use Graham's criticism of Trump as evidence that Graham is a rhino who can't be trusted? Does the MAGA base rally behind Dans as the true Trump supporter? Does Trump reconsider his endorsement of Graham if it looks like Graham is vulnerable and if the base is pushing him to back Dans instead? Primary polls in South Carolina over the next few months will give us early signals about whether Graham's position is tenable, or whether this break with Trump on the pardons has created an opening for Dans to mount a serious challenge. Fifth, watch what happens with the next controversial Trump action. The pardons were just the first week. Trump is going to do a lot more things that are controversial, that push legal boundaries, that test constitutional limits. Is Graham going to speak up again next time Trump does something he thinks is wrong? Or was this a one-time thing where Graham felt he had to draw a line on violent attacks against police, but otherwise he's going back to being a loyal Trump defender? If Graham continues to voice concerns when he has them, that's a sign he's trying to maintain some independence and he's willing to risk Trump's anger. If this was a one-off and Graham goes back to defending everything Trump does, that suggests this was more about managing his relationship with law enforcement constituencies in South Carolina than about any principled stand on presidential power or political violence. Sixth, watch for signs of whether this affects Trump's willingness to use the pardon power going forward. Does he become more cautious about controversial pardons knowing that even loyal allies like Graham will criticize him publicly? Does he start making more distinctions between different types of cases and different levels of culpability? Or does he double down and start issuing even more controversial pardons to show that he's not going to be constrained by criticism from anyone? Trump's pattern in the past has often been to escalate when he faces criticism, to do more of whatever people are criticizing him for, as a way of showing that he won't be intimidated. If that pattern holds, we could see more controversial pardons coming soon specifically to demonstrate that Trump doesn't care what Graham or anyone else thinks. Seventh, watch the legal and political fallout from the pardons themselves. There are almost certainly going to be lawsuits challenging the pardons, arguing that a president can't pardon people for crimes committed to keep the president in power because that effectively makes the president above the law. There are going to be victims' rights advocates speaking up, police officers who were injured on January 6 telling their stories, families of officers who have suffered because of the attacks. There are going to be Democrats using this in every speech and every campaign ad from now until 2026 and beyond, arguing that Republicans don't really support law enforcement. They only support law enforcement when officers are enforcing laws against people Republicans don't like. The political and cultural battle over the meaning of January 6th and the legitimacy of the pardons is going to continue for months and years, and Graham's public criticism gives that opposition a powerful talking point because it shows that even Trump's closest allies think he went too far. So here's the bottom line. Lindsey Graham just publicly broke with Donald Trump on one of the president's signature first-week actions, and he did it on national television in a way that can't be walked back or reinterpreted. He called the pardons of violent January 6th rioters a mistake. He said it sends the wrong message about violence and law enforcement, and he explicitly worried that it could encourage more political violence in the future. This is a huge deal because Graham is one of Trump's closest Senate allies, because Graham desperately needs Trump's support to survive a primary challenge from the MAGA right, and because Trump is famously intolerant of public criticism from people in his own party. The fact that Graham was willing to take this risk, to publicly disagree with Trump on an issue this central to Trump's political identity, and this important to his base, suggests either that Graham feels he has no choice, because staying silent would be even more politically damaging with law enforcement constituencies, or that Graham has decided there are certain lines he won't cross, even if it means risking his relationship with Trump. The next few weeks are going to be absolutely critical for determining how this plays out. Does Trump retaliate against Graham? Does he pull his endorsement? Does he start backing Paul Dans? Does he go on the attack? Do other Republican senators start speaking up about issues they disagree with Trump on? Or does Graham remain isolated? Do law enforcement groups rally behind Graham's criticism? Or do they stay silent because they don't want to alienate Trump either? Does this affect Trump's legislative agenda on Capitol Hill? Does it make it harder for him to maintain Republican unity on controversial votes? These are all questions we're going to get answers to very soon, and those answers are going to tell us a lot about the balance of power within the Republican Party, about Trump's ability to demand absolute loyalty even when he makes decisions that contradict core Republican principles, and about whether there's any space left for dissent or independent judgment among Republican elected officials. This is the kind of story that looks like just another political squabble on the surface, but that actually reveals fundamental tensions about power, loyalty, principles, and the future direction of American democracy. Graham is trying to walk an impossible line, trying to maintain his loyalty to Trump while also drawing boundaries around what he's willing to defend, and it's not clear that line can actually be walked successfully. Trump doesn't do nuance, he doesn't accept partial loyalty, he demands that you're either with him completely or you're against him. Graham is about to find out whether there's any room in Trump's Republican Party for people who want to support the president most of the time, but who also want to maintain the ability to say no when they think he's gone too far. Keep your eyes on this story. Keep watching how Trump responds. Keep watching whether Graham holds firm or backs down. Keep watching whether this creates an opening for more Republicans to speak up, or whether it reinforces the lesson that criticizing Trump publicly is political suicide. This could be a turning point in how Republicans relate to Trump in his second term, or it could be just another example of Trump crushing dissent and maintaining total control over his party. We're going to find out very soon which one it is.